Joining me today, without further ado, is Dr. Ali Michael. Dr. Michael is a nationally recognized expert in racial equity in education. As co-director and co-founder of the Race Institute for K-12 Educators, Dr. Michael works with schools and organizations across the United States to help make research on race, whiteness, and education more accessible and relevant to educators. Prior to publishing Our Problem, Our Path with Eleonora Bartoli, Dr. Michael co-wrote with Tony Graves Williamson a young adult adaptation of Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. And in 2015, she published Raising Race Questions, Whiteness, Inquiry, and Education. And that same year, she co-edited the best-selling book, Everyday White People Confront Racial and Social Justice, 15 Stories. In 2017, she co-edited another bestseller, Guide for White Women Who Teach Black Boys. And in 2021, Teaching Beautiful and Brilliant Black Girls. Dr. Michael is a member of the editorial board for the journal Whiteness in Education. She teaches in the Diversity and Inclusion program at Princeton University and in the Equity Institutes for Higher Education here at the USC Race and Equity Center. Ali, welcome to our center's inaugural Equity Book Talk series.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's good to be here. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for this talk, but also for all you do to create excellent resources for educators. I really appreciate you and the center.
Well, we could not be more thrilled that you're here and agreed to join us. And we're so very grateful for the many important contributions you have made to our profession, especially with your most recent book, Our Problem, Our Path. I'd love to jump in if you're ready.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So you begin your book by describing your first interaction with your co-author. You both had been attending a workshop in grad school, and she asked you, "Do you want to start a white affinity group?" So you started a group with her and your partner, your sister's partner, and you tell readers we could get vulnerable. We would correct one another, not in a competitive way, but in the spirit of mutual accountability, knowing we'd all have the same goal of taking the next step on our anti-racist paths. You say our ability to learn arose from the powerful combination of company, camaraderie, accountability, challenge, friendship, and love. And it gave us an opportunity to ask all the questions we needed to ask, questions we were unable to ask elsewhere because we felt like we had already or should have known the answers. So, why do white people need to talk to other white people about racism? And when I ask you that question, I'm also wondering which white people should we be turning to first?
Thanks for having me. Thanks for all of this. All right. So why should white people talk to other white people about racism? First of all, because white people are around other white people all the time. We are around other white people a lot. And so if white people aren't talking with other white people about racism, then there's large times throughout the day when we're not talking about it, we're not thinking about it. And it's funny because, when I first heard about the idea of a white anti-racist learning space, like just white people talking to other white people about race, it seemed like it seemed very counterintuitive and like such a wild idea. Like, what are we going to learn? Like, how are we going to learn if we don't hear from people of color, if we don't talk to people of color? Um, and I think, what you slowly realize is like, you can learn from people of color, but it doesn't have to be the person who happens to work in the cubicle next to you or who happens to sit next to you in class. You actually are learning from people who wrote books and produced movies and who are trying to get messages out there. You can listen to podcasts, you can read articles, but you don't have to like rely on the one person who happens to be a person of color in your path as you go along your day to educate you. It's funny because we don't question like, well, what if we have an all-white hiring committee or an all-white board of directors or an all-white department, for example? Like, we don't question like, wait a second, this space is all white. How can all these white people be talking to each other without people of color? Those are the spaces where we have all white people that we really should be questioning. Whereas this all white learning spaces are really spaces where you can do basically what I call culturally relevant pedagogy for white people. it's an opportunity for white people to learn the skills and competencies that they might not have learned growing up. And because so many white people in the US grew up in spaces of racial segregation, and often not talking about race, we have different skills and competencies to learn than people of color and Native people have, just because of a different level of exposure to the conversation itself. And so for me, this group, we would meet in a small group in our apartment in New York City, and we would, we usually, it was a book club, but we'd meet for 24 hours because Eleonora would come in from Philadelphia, and we'd do all the exercises that were laid out in the books. We'd role play, we'd ask hard questions, and we would practice. And I would find that I had to say things that I had been conditioned in my own childhood growing up as somebody who was raised really to be colorblind, um, to not say. So like I had to practice saying things like, I'm white. That wasn't something that rolled off the tongue for me. I'd have to practice using racialized terms. And this wasn't the beginning of my talking about race. This was after 4 years of studying race in undergrad, but not quite knowing how and when to talk about it. I teach 7th grade math to a predominantly Black class. Should I talk with them about white supremacy? I mean, what's like, what am I supposed to understand about this? And what am I supposed to convey? And how much am I supposed to bring it up? And I had so many questions, and I was aware in multiracial spaces that those weren't spaces for some of the questions that I had, but this space, this was a place where I could ask questions and we could work through the answers together. And then, well, like, who are the white people we should turn to first if you're white and you're thinking, I want to start a white anti-racist learning space? Back then, it was called an affinity space. I think you look for the folks who could be both allies and friends. So, like, friends are complicated. Like, these folks who were in my group with me they were both allies and friends, which means that they were willing to hold me accountable to my anti-racist goals. People who are just friends are people who kind of want to let me off the hook. Like, oh, if I say like, oh, I committed this microaggression, I called an Asian American student by another Asian American student's name. And I remember this very specifically. And this friend said to me, oh, but you didn't mean to do that. And I'm sure that happens a lot. And it's like, you obviously, the fact that you're talking about it now means you're very well intended. And I remember thinking to myself, that's what a friend did. Like, you're being a friend to me right now, but you're not being an ally to me, because you're not joining me in my desire to hold myself accountable for this. An ally doesn't shame you, but a white ally would say, like, tell me more. Oh, that's painful. I know that's painful for them. I know it's painful for you. I know that's not what you were trying to do. How did you fix it? How did you respond? They might say, I've done that before too, because it's likely that they have. Here's what I did. But they might join me rather than isolate me, or, say something like, oh, aren't you a terrible person? I mean, it's not about punishing each other. It's about supporting one another, joining one another, and helping people take that next step.
Thank you, Ali. And I think riffing on this theme of accountability and allyship, I want to talk about how your book is broken up and dig into part one, where you explore some of the relationships you've had in this work. Your book is organized into three parts: beginnings, seeing ourselves in the here and now, and who will we be as the racial hierarchy falls. In part one, you talk about your relationship and journey with your dad through the many conversations about race and racism you've had with him since college. You refer to one conversation in your book in particular that was pivotal, and your relationship with him. And before this conversation happened, you tell readers, I knew a lot about anti-racism, but I only really knew how to listen to people who knew more than I did. I didn't know how to talk to white people who disagreed with me or had different assumptions or knew less than I did about race. Tell us what happened in this conversation with your dad that was so different from your past conversations with him. Why do you think this pivot you made in your conversation with him ultimately shaped how you learned to have different conversations about racism with white people?
Well, so it started when I went to college and I started learning about racism in a way that I had never learned in my family growing up. And I was actually required to take an African American literature course that I wanted to take, but wouldn't have taken if it hadn't been required, because I felt like I don't really belong there and I don't know what I'm going to contribute to that class. But it was in that class where I started hearing narratives that I had never heard before, and history that I hadn't heard, and a teacher who just kind of put it all in front of us. And I would go home and try to explain some of the things I was learning, and my dad really wasn't hearing it. And we started to have debates. And as I went through college, I continued to, every semester I'd take courses on African history, African American history, and race and racism. And at one point in a debate with my dad, I just was like, I was so frustrated because I didn't know how to say. Basically, I wanted to say, like, could you just read all the books I've read and hear all the stories I've heard and listen to everything I've listened to? And I was just fed up, and I was like, you're racist. I mean, you know, that was like my comeback. And I think at the time I was also in this place of like, I'm anti-racist. That's my identity. So if I can make dad the racist and I'm the anti-racist, then knocking him out makes me anti him. And so therefore I'm doing what I should be doing. Like, I don't want to be silent. I don't want to let this stand. And so if I can knock him out, then I win, basically. That, I think that was some of the thinking. I mean, part of it was frustration, but part of it was like, I need to be anti-racist. And in this scenario, he's the racist. And in actuality, when I look back on it, and this has happened a lot of times in my life, he was the foil. He was the foil in my efforts to position myself a particular way. And in reality, it's not about whether I beat him in that conversation or I cut him down. It's about whether I help him take the next step on his learning journey, which I didn't do in that moment. And so years passed where he wouldn't talk to me about race and racism. I think because he saw me as a disrespectful adversary. He didn't want, he was like, you know, we would talk about other things, but it was kind of like, you know, I'm just gonna leave the room when you bring that up because you're not somebody I can talk to. And I kind of saw this happening, and I saw it happening with other people too, like my graduate students. And I realized like there has to be a way to help people learn, because I don't want to just alienate people from this conversation. And finally, I was taking a long drive with my dad, and I said to him, look, like, I know we haven't always had the most successful conversations about racism, but I just want you to know, I don't know everything, but I'm trying to learn. And like, I know there's a lot of things you know that I don't know. And I just, if you have questions, if you want to talk about it, maybe we could think about the questions together. And that was kind of the beginning. And he actually said to me, like, yeah, I have questions. Like, so if race isn't biological, why are so many more Black people basketball players than white people? And I was like, I don't know, but let's think through this. Let's think through this from the perspective of social construction. And that was the beginning of a lot of conversations with my dad. We've had, you know, for the last couple decades, we've had conversations that are ongoing. And recently, he said to me, you know, I can list all the anti-Black ideas I used to have that informed the way I thought, the way I voted, the way I made decisions that I don't believe anymore. He could list those things. And recently, he was in a car with a colleague carpooling who was saying all kinds of racist things. And I said, well, what did you say in response? And he said, well, I just thought, I wish Allie was here because she'd know what to say. And I said, no, the thing is, if I was there, that guy would never listen to me. He wouldn't. He will listen to you. Like, you have such similar backgrounds. It's so important that you're talking to him and that I'm not in that car. And so that he went back the next time they were carpooling, and he disagreed with him a little bit, tried to find out more about where he was, and then they decided to exchange books. So my dad gave him a copy of The New Jim Crow, and he gave my dad a copy of a book that informs his thinking, and they're going to talk about them. And, you know, this for me, I mean, it's my dad, but there's so many different ways this has happened with students, or that we could think about this. This, for me, it's like my job that day was not to knock my dad out so that I could show I was anti-racist, because what that does is it also knocks him off an anti-racist path. My job is to lean into him and say, well, what do you know? And what do you not know? What makes you say that? and then to support him to take the next step on his anti-racist path. And when I started doing that, we were both on a path that was much more mutually supportive. It became like my household, my family became a place where anti-racism was cultivated and growing because we were supporting one another. But it also became this basically what happened was then he has a different sphere of influence than I do. And he walks in the world in a different way than I do. And so some people are going to listen to him who would never listen to me. And so it's important that I be able to support him to be able to take action where he is with who he is. He doesn't need to be Allie. He needs to be him. I need to be me. Each one of us, we don't need like one super anti-racist per household or per class or per organization, right? We actually need millions of white people who are showing up and doing and like being engaging anti-racism in their sphere of influence and supporting one another to do that when it's hard, when it's lonely, when they have questions, when the bar to entry feels too high, when they feel like they don't know enough. And so that's the purpose of this book, is that as we think about meeting white people where they are, it's not about being kinder and gentler. I think people sometimes mistake it for that. It's actually about being strategic. And it happens to be that shaming people and yelling that they're racist actually doesn't help. It doesn't help them grow. Actually, it's not that that has never worked. I mean, it's like that has woken me up sometimes. But in general, the way to get people to engage for the long term is to support them. And I'll just say one other thing, John, which is like, this is my strategy for how white people can help other white people learn and grow. I don't I don't I don't believe that I have the expertise to tell people of color and Native people how they should be responding to white people. I actually think that the way that people of color and Native people respond to racism has to have more to do with their own self-preservation in that moment than what's going to help the white person grow. So it's a different strategy, but I think too often white people model our strategies um, as if like we could be offended on somebody else's behalf or something, and that just it doesn't work. And so that's why this is what works for me.
In part two, you move into the main body of work in the book, and you begin chapter one by claiming racism is not a person of color's problem. You refer to James Baldwin's work, who wrote, who you write, said, often implored people to see that racism is not a person of color's or a Native person's problem, as it is so often framed that racism is a white person's problem. And it won't change until white people see that and do something about it. Many white people do not see racism as our problem. And in the 2 years that have passed since the publication of your book, the fury over critical race theory, gender, and sexuality continues to escalate. As I mentioned in the beginning of today's session, in June, we received the Supreme Court's decision last June to strike down race-conscious college admissions policies. And last month, we learned news that the U.S. House Office of Diversity and Inclusion will be dissolved as part of the government spending bill that just passed. Why don't many white people see racism as our problem? How does your book help white people have different, more productive conversations about race and racism, especially during a time when systematic efforts to structurally suppress those conversations are so pervasive in our schools and educational spaces?
Hmm. Well, I can start with where I grew up, which is that, I grew up thinking that we're supposed to be colorblind. We're not supposed to talk about race. And that racism was somebody else's problem. Like, first of all, people of color have to deal with it. That was clear. But then I was like, I'm not causing racism and it's not impacting me. So I kind of felt like I was in this other category. And I had all these myths about who was causing racism, as people from the South or white people from working class backgrounds, white people from the South, and I didn't think like I had all this mythology about like where racism came from and no analysis of systemic racism. So I thought, well, like we live in this community with almost all white people and like a couple Black families and a couple Indian American families. And like we're all nice to each other. So there's no racism here. And I didn't have the capacity to scroll back and see that we actually lived in a community that was 99.8% white. And that that was a result of very intentional social and public policy that was systemic racism. That you don't have in a multiracial country like ours, you don't have all white communities except through intentional legal and often personal violence. And so that was the first part, was realizing like actually, I spent my whole life thinking, well, until I was 18, so my whole life spent all my baby years thinking racism has nothing to do with me. And then suddenly I realized racism has actually impacted every day of my life. So it was a huge shift to realize I'm impacted by racism too. And then also to realize racism, obviously it benefits white people in very structural ways in terms of access to resource and opportunity, but it also hurts white people. And, there are several ways in which this happens in terms of the way it limits our relationships. And Heather McGhee talks in The Sum of Us about the ways in which white people basically support policies that hurt their own lives because they don't want people of color to have what they have. But it also hurts white people in that racism is essentially a divide and conquer strategy. And so there's a law professor at Columbia named Barbara Arnwine who says fascism thrives on racism. Fascism requires racism. You have to be able to divide a population against itself in order to be able to control it. So anti-racism has to be foundational to democracy. And like if living in a democratic small d society is a critical aspect of my health and well-being, then anti-racism is too. And so recognizing that racism is a white person problem because it hurts me too. And part of what James Baldwin was saying, I mean, James Baldwin also talked a lot about how like the white people he was seeing in the South were just like hollow shells of people because they were working so hard to uphold an unjust system that they had nothing to live for. I mean, his descriptions are really vivid. So he does talk about how racism hurts white people, but he also was saying like, we actually can't fix this. Like people of color can't fix racism without white people. And it just like women can't stop sexism. Women aren't causing sexism. We need men to address sexism. Trans and non-binary people cannot fix transphobia without cisgender people. It's just that's not what they're not the cause of it. And so I think that recognizing how critical white people were was really important in my own development. And then the question became, so what do I do if I'm a white person who really cares about doing something in my own interest? Even what is it that I can do and can do well so that I'm not like stepping on somebody else's toes, but I'm also actively engaged in this in an ongoing way. And so in terms of the book, in terms of helping white people see this as our problem, I mean, the very first chapter really tries to address like how racism hurts white people. And then, one of the things that we're trying to address when Eleonora and I we started this book in 2020. We started it right after George Floyd was murdered, and we were both feeling a lot of despair. And originally we actually wanted to call it So I'm Fragile, Now What? Because everybody was reading White Fragility, and everybody was like, I'm fragile, but I don't know what to do. And we were trying to say, but there's a path forward. There's a path here. We need, yes, we're fragile. And a lot of people were weaponizing it, like, you're fragile. No, you're fragile. And it's like, well, technically what D'Angelo says is like, if you grow up white in a white supremacist society, you're probably fragile. It's probably hard to learn about this. It's probably confusing, and you probably are defensive. So like the chances are everybody's fragile, at most white people or anybody with a dominant identity. So where do we go from there? What do we do? And this book is really supposed to lay out a path for people. We talk about this book as a manual we hope people will hold on to for their whole lives, because there's emotional, psychological exercises, and there's a lot of background on what people may have learned as children, and then how to have a white anti-racist learning group as they get older. Our goal is to really lower the bar to entry, to not, I think sometimes white people think racism is not my problem. Like the same reason I didn't want to take the African American literature course. I don't belong there. I don't know enough. I wouldn't know what to say. Like the bar of entry feels so high. And it's confusing to me because we have white supremacist movements in this country that are recruiting young white people into them. And when those young people get out of those movements, they've written, or the parents have written, about the ways in which they have said, I just really wanted a place where I felt like my perspective was respected and where I felt like I belonged. And I think to myself, wow, so we have these hate movements where young white people feel belonging and respect. And then we have a racial justice movement, which to me is a love movement. And people feel like they don't fit there. And so I think, part of what I want to do is say to people, you can fit. And like the bar to entry is high because it's hard to form multiracial coalitions if you've never learned about your own internalized superiority as a white person, if you've never learned the history of racism, if you think we've all been treated the same all this time. It's hard. And yet we need to be able to support each other to learn that. And so the book also tries to give people role models for thinking about this. I think sometimes young white people, or any white people trying to learn about anti-racism, hear people of color talk and are like, yes, yes, yes. But then they're like, but what would it look like if I were to say something? What would it look like for me to do something? What action can I take? And then it starts to get confusing. And then like really to like name and talk about whiteness. When I first started teaching a class on whiteness in 2007 at Penn, it was called Counseling and Educational Perspectives on Whiteness. And at the time, there were very few classes on whiteness around the country. I think there's still only a small number. But like saying the word white, getting white people to self-identify as white in a public way felt scandalous. That's changing. There's a lot that's changing about how much we talk about that, but continuing to explore whiteness is important for white people, because I think we learn about racism. Yes, racism is clear, and we understand some of the history of whiteness. I mean, of racism, but understanding how it's impacted you as a white person is part of how you see, oh, racism is a white person problem too. It's part of how you start to turn that dime and see yourself in the equation a little bit more. And so that's part of what we're trying to do in an accessible way with this book.
I'd love to talk. Thank you, and I'd love to talk about some of the chapters, including chapter two. We have the time remaining. You outline five myths of white supremacy. The first of which is that it's rude to talk about race. We should all be colorblind. The first myth. You wrote, for all the historical, psychological, sociological, social, political, and educational reasons why my family didn't talk about race, the impact was that we didn't and couldn't talk about racism. We came to see racial talk as racist talk. I still encounter this misunderstanding today when I mention the racial background of a person, and a teenager will say in response, why do you need to name their race? Isn't that racist? Why is using what you call racial language and what other experts have called race conscious, color conscious, or identity conscious language construed by many white people as racist?
So I just want to name that it's not actually my term. It comes from Michael Omi and Howard Winan, who are psychologists who are really trying to give us a bridge out of this idea that we have to be colorblind, and that when we talk about race, it's racist. And that was the ideology I grew up with in my community. And it wasn't written somewhere. Nobody ever said, like, you can't talk about race. But it was more just like understood that this is not something that polite people do. So I thought that was like the ethos of my community. Then I started talking about this more publicly, and I tell people my story, and I thought, wow, there's a lot of people who grew up like this. A lot of white people who were told not to talk about race, or, who said it was racist to talk about race. And then I was reading Alicia Garza's book with The Purpose of Power. And she talks about the way that the like insistence on colorblindness was actually in the 1980s coming from the White House. And it was a way of framing Black nationalists who were fighting for civil rights as racists. They're the racists. They keep bringing up racism. They're like, if they would just be colorblind, like the rest of us have learned to be polite, you don't talk about race. That's what good people do. They're the bad people. They're the ones who keep bringing up racism. Clearly, they're the racists. And it was so interesting for me to realize like that this is that when our government promotes certain ideologies, there's a way that it trickles down into communities, and that's what's happening right now with all of the things that you mentioned, John, about the current laws, which are outlawing reading certain books, having conversations about Black history, reading about LGBTQ experiences or about Black people. I mean, even there was one teacher in Florida who was a Black woman herself who said, I feel like I can't even say somebody is Black or I might lose my job. In Virginia, there's the governor set up a hotline. So any parent can report a teacher who says something or does something that makes them uncomfortable. And so people like the idea that we can't talk about race is very prevalent right now, and it's being legally mandated in certain places. Um, and what I didn't real I'm not sure it was legally mandated in the 1980s. I don't think it was, but it was striking to me how big an impact that can have, because I had to physiologically untrain my body to not be ashamed of that. And still, every time I talk about race in public, I feel embarrassed. It feels like the stakes are higher. Even when I applied for IRB in my doctoral work, just the fact that it was about race meant that it had to be raised a level of scrutiny, because anything about race is more sensitive, more possibly dangerous. And so I feel like this is pretty common in our society to really like treat any conversation about race tenderly. As you know, we should do it well and we should do it sensitively. But it's fascinating uh, that like we actually can't change anything unless we're able to talk about race. And what Omi and Wynant were saying was that we need like when people say, "Oh, that's racist," we need to be able to say, "Actually, it's racial." You know, there's nothing to be embarrassed about. There's nothing to be ashamed about, and to help people unlearn some of that physiological resistance to having that conversation.
Well, we're going to jump ahead to part three and talk about chapter eight, where you address the importance of white people talking to other white people about race and building on this theme of making those distinctions, and including Eleonora's focus on healing as essential to anti-racist practice. You introduce a concrete, practical strategy called support, challenge, contextualize. As someone who regularly works with school leaders and teachers seeking practical ways to intervene with when students, parents, or other educators make racist, prejudicial remarks or biased remarks, I was especially grateful for this strategy. I noticed, though, it was missing a step that many educators, myself included, have sometimes impulsively taken in these moments, these situations when a racist remark is made, trying to achieve some sort of resolution. That step was missing. Tell us more about this strategy and why it is not contingent upon achieving a resolution.
Well, I think we fundamentally believe that people are in progress and that our job is when we interact with people, my job is to support them to take the next step on their anti-racist path. So when they say something racist, first of all, if we're not in a relationship, there's very little chance that they're going to listen to me. Um, and and you know, like I said with my dad, if I felt like in that moment when I called him racist, if the expectation was that I'm gonna like change him in that half an hour conversation and he's gonna rethink everything he ever thought in his life, it wouldn't be a very substantial change. And in fact, Eleanor and I talk a lot about 2020. And she said the other day, it feels like um, in 2020, most white people in the US got the beginning of a set of antibiotics. We got like 14 pills, 14 pills that we were supposed to take. And like in 2020, we took two of them and then we stopped. And so as a result, there's like all these strains of racism that are resistant to the anti-racism learning strategies that we've used in the past. And because people like got a little taste of it and then they like gave it up, and then they somehow have like created all of these resistant strains because it's such a difference. It's like there's so much backlash right now. And so I think what we want to emphasize is that it's not enough, like that we have to support people to take all 14 doses or 28 or 75, whatever it is. We have to support people to continue to learn. And so support, challenge, contextualize does three things. Support is about supporting the person and their intention. It's about recognizing something good about them. Challenge is challenging what they said. And then contextualize is saying, like, it makes sense that you would say that or that you would think that because we live in a society that's constantly delivering us that message. And the goal there is to help people realize that, like, what we're unlearning is what is something that we acquire from our placement in a racist system. Not that you as an individual are bad or there's something wrong with you, but rather that like we all live in the system and we absorb some of the things that it teaches us. And so it makes sense that we would be reflecting that out. So on a meeting recently, somebody said something like, I don't care if a student is black, green, yellow, orange, polka dotted, they're welcome in my classroom. And so what I said to them, first of all, I just really appreciate what you're trying to say here. Like, you support students no matter what their background. Like, you accept your students and you accept their background, and they're all welcome in your classroom. And I really appreciate that. And I wanted to let you know, because you deeply care about your students, that when you start talking about purple students, green students, polka dot students, make it sound like these are just superficial differences rather than like racial categories that were established legally and that really did not only segregate us, but give us different access to resource and opportunities. It's important to recognize that, but it also makes sense that you would say that because I've heard that from so many places. I used to say that. And I think it's a way that people try to say like that they don't want race to impact people's life chances. And so but I thought I'd let you know because it could be deeply hurtful to the students that you care about. So support, challenge, like too often what we do is we support, but we forget to challenge, or we challenge and there's no support. So people just feel called out. And then when we don't contextualize, it feels like, oh, I'm bad. I did something wrong. Instead of like, yeah, like you basically you manifested things that are pretty deeply ingrained in our society, and that we're trying to dig up, but that you're not the only one who thinks that. And so but the idea that there doesn't have to be resolution, I mean, there's lots of aspects of that. One is that people will often go away and chew on it some more. And the question is like, does your intervention support them to continue to chew on it instead of to resist? It's also the idea that like um, they're not going to just in that moment be like, oh yes, Allie, I should just do everything you say, because their beliefs are really deeply embedded and hard earned for them. And so if they're rethinking them, it's gonna take time. And ideally, they're going to see you as somebody that they could come back to and continue to ask questions of as they move forward in their own path.
And what's so distinctive about your book is the how you co-wrote it, co-partnered with Eleonora, who's a clinical psychologist, and includes these internal work sections in every chapter. And by the time we get to chapter 9, we have a section titled "To Prepare for Anti-Racist Action, You Must Train for Courage." And this really deeply resonated with me thinking about each time I've had a version of these conversations with white people, there's been such activation, a range of activation. Let's call it a continuum. And the hostility can immediately surface, and you can feel it. It can really come at you hard in some cases, or it could be implied subtly and grow as the conversation continues. And I think, so I just want to point to this section and ask you more about it. So in this particular internal work section in chapter 9, she writes that successful anti-racist action successfully challenges systems founded on white supremacy, to which our safety as white people is tied. And so I think that that piece, full stop, was like, oh yeah, so safety, someone's sense of safety is at stake. They might be sort of transferring, projecting some sort of fear of losing something that's being, sort of threatened by calling out a racial bias or a racist comment. And she goes on to say, you can't eliminate fear when the threat is real because your body is accurately perceiving it. You can only expand your ability to tolerate such emotions so that you can operate effectively while being fearful to an appropriate, realistic extent. She goes on to say the antidote to fear is not self blame or shame. Shame only makes you more afraid. The antidote to fear is courage. And I read those lines. I gotta tell you, I had to put the book down for a few minutes. It process seemed like, what, I don't know, it seemed like 10,000 situations in which, I sort of weighed the known threats and the potential consequences of challenging racist ideas expressed by other white people who might actually retaliate, and in some cases did. And none of those situations involved me calling them a racist, but they most involved simply calling attention to the racial bias and the language, the thinking, the decisions that were at stake. And so despite having courage in those situations, these situations sometimes resulted in real retaliation. That was, really, difficult and stayed with me for sure, no matter how carefully handled. And the consequences continue sometimes to resurface. So, as someone who's been has made it your life's work to meaningfully engage other white people and seeing racism as our problem, you talk about some of the real consequences you've experienced after having this courage. How did you navigate that terrain? How did you sort of follow uh, Eleonora's advice?
Yeah. I love this part of the book because it's like it's not mine. Eleanor is a trauma therapist, and her practice really, like, she is a private counselor for people who are activists, often people who are burnout activists. So she's very immersed in supporting people like me. And I find, like, when I am struggling, I go back to this book, even though I edited her piece. I've read all of her pieces 100 times. When I have a conflict, I will go back to her pieces and read them. And what's amazing is that I read them differently because I'm in either panic or conflict, and or fight, flight, freeze mode. And I hear the way she talks to the reader as a therapist, which I couldn't hear when I was not activated. And so it has helped me, and I did a session. Actually, this was a session on how to talk to white kids about race, but in the process, I used an example that activated a participant of color who wrote to me afterwards. And her feedback kind of triggered this thing in me where I was like, oh, I shouldn't be doing this work. Who am I to say? I mean, who am I to talk about this topic? Like, what do I know? It kind of triggered all these self-doubts. And then I thought, I got to go to Eleonora's book because I'm spinning out here and I need to respond to this email. And so I was able to go to one of her pieces and do some of the exercises about grounding the body. And I find I do it, like, this year I've been leading a lot of talks on Israel Palestine, and I find I have to ground myself. I have to do these things that help me ground myself, not because uh, it doesn't make me less afraid, but it makes me more able to access my internal resources. It makes me more, it facilitates a range of motion where I have more choice and I'm not like in fight, flight, freeze mode and I'm just trying to figure, to respond. I think in terms of like the very real consequences of speaking up, it's interesting. I was doing a presentation with Howard Stevenson about managing racial stress, and he was talking about how Black people can manage racial stress, and I was supposed to talk about how white people can manage racial stress. And I said to him before we started, doesn't this seem a little bit disjointed or like disproportionate? Because I feel like when Black people experience racial stress, it's really much more life-threatening. Whereas when white people have racial stress, it's like, I said the wrong thing in the workshop, that it doesn't feel like the same thing. And he said, he thought about it for a minute and he said, no, if white people were better at managing their racial stress, Black people wouldn't have so much to manage. And we wouldn't have the same number of life-threatening situations. And so this idea that we have to be able to manage our stress and be able to meet people, like you said, like sometimes you're going to meet people who are resistant to the things that you are saying. And it's not because you don't say it in a supportive, challenging, contextualizing way. It's because of whatever's going on with them. But the more we can look at a person and say, like, where are you on your journey, and what do I need to say to help you take your next step, the more impactful we're going to be. The thing is, that is a step for a lot of the white people in my life. There's also strategy that we need to engage in around politicians. Like, I'm not going to go to Ron DeSantis and be like, what's the next step on your journey? Because he has a lot of power. He's hurting a lot of people right now. And like strategizing to get him out of office is really important. So this is not the strategy I would use with like a lot of people who hold power and who need to, whose decisions need to be questioned more readily, more publicly, or to be challenged. But I think about those like middle 60% of white people who actually really don't like racism, who want to be anti-racist, don't quite know how, and who would walk an anti-racist path but can't find the trailhead. And they need some guidance, they need some support. And sometimes those people are the people in departments who will be sitting on a hiring committee who'll be like, yeah, like I can hear, I can identify that they're choosing the anti-racist candidate and I want to be on board with that, and that like white people can get on board with anti-racist decision making, but they need a certain basic level of competence and willingness to think racially and in an anti-racist way. But I don't want to, I know there's some people like there's sometimes people that uh stand in the way of racial progress, and that we need to think about and strategize around that. And as we build a collective of people who can be engaged in that, we need to do so in a way that invites people rather than raises the bar of entry so that people feel like there's no room for them.
Thank you so much, Ali. You've bared with me through many questions in this hour. And before we go into your reference to Israel and Palestine, how have you been thinking about what's been happening on our college campuses and how your work around promoting dialogue connects to what's happening on our campuses?
Mm, that's such a good question. I don't, I have so many different thoughts about it. Um, One is that I'm just grateful. I'm grateful to the students who are lifting this up and who are asking us to talk about it, because I feel like this is a conversation that has been repressed for many years, but also especially since October 7th. And these are the students who are seniors this year are students who um, they came of age, like they were graduating from high school when George Floyd was killed. So they know came of age in a time of protest. And they're kind of saying like, why aren't we talking about this? And so I think whether we agree with them or not, I think it's important to recognize that they're saying this is a democratic right to be able to talk and to demand that we be able to talk about these things. And so I really appreciate that they're bringing that up. particularly as we think about the ways in which our democracy is currently being challenged. And I feel like we have, I mentioned that racism is critical to fascism. And I think that we have a large number of people on the far right who desire, and in many cases have like created laws to prevent us from learning about the actual history of the United States, from reading certain books, from having certain conversations. And I feel like there are ways that the pain and trauma of Jewish people in the US is currently being exploited by those folks who want to dampen our democratic rights to vote, to free speech. And so I feel like these students are standing in the way. They're like putting a foot in the door and saying, wait, 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 no, we have to talk. And I just appreciate that. I want to mention, John, if I can, that I lived in Jerusalem in 2009 with my partner. He was studying Judaism as part of his graduate program, and I was studying whiteness at Penn for my PhD. But I had an internship during that time to try to. It was with the Palestinian Sesame Street, which is called Shara Simsim. It was in Ramallah, which is in the West Bank. And so I would travel regularly to the West Bank. And then we would travel around the West Bank, taking the Muppets kind of on the road for the Sesame Street show. And we'd go to schools all over the West Bank, to Nablus, to Hebron, to Bethlehem. And and I would come back at night, and my partner and I would have very different views of the conflict, because I had spent the day in public transportation and coming through the checkpoints, and he'd spent the day in West Jerusalem and in primarily Jewish spaces. And so we found ourselves fighting. And one of the things that we realized was this conflict could divide, it could split us up. And we could get divorced over this conflict, and the conflict wouldn't care. And I think that's true in general of like this conflict will divide families, communities, synagogues. It will divide colleges. It will divide countries, this conflict, but it won't be healed by that. And so what we realized was that we needed to talk to each other, we needed to listen to each other, and we needed to learn together. And that was how we were going to stay together and continue to learn, to like live in our integrity around what was going on. And so that's my hope and my wish for college campuses and for all of us, is that we don't import the conflict. That's language that comes from peace activists, uh, Ali Abu Awad, who's Palestinian, and Amidar, who's Israeli. They say, don't import the conflict. Because right now we're paying more attention to what's happening in terms of protests in the US, and we're not paying attention to what's happening in Gaza, in Israel, in the West Bank. So we've shifted the focus unnecessarily. We've imported the conflict when what we need to be doing is learning together and talking about it. But we haven't been doing that. And so I appreciate that what the students right now are saying to us is, let's start, let's talk, because there's a lot that we all need to know. There's a lot that we need to be able to learn, but let's not import the conflict, lest we be divided by it as well.
Well, we're just at the top of the hour. Do you have a few more minutes to stay on with
I
us?
do. Yeah. Oh, excuse me. It's
Yeah.
already 8 o'clock. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your willingness to answer my questions and your incredibly thoughtful responses. Our team is going to help us address some questions from the audience. So for those of you still on, please share your questions in the chat or use the raise your hand feature. We'd love to hear from you if you'd like to talk to Ali directly and into our conversation. In our conversation, excuse me, and we'll also we're gonna turn off the spotlight so we can see everybody. Uh, just a moment. There we go. Okay, great. Okay,
Good to see everybody who's got their picture up.
great. There's a question from Kelsey in the Q&A. around ways to counter protest these censorship movements. I wonder, how has your work intersected with any counter movements with respect to all these censorship laws? Building on this question of how do we support educators who are in locales or in states in which these draconian measures have sort of come down on censoring their ability to speak freely in classrooms. One of the other questions related to that was these hotlines that have come up and the ways of challenging cis heteronormative practices in K-12 schools. Yeah.
Great. This is a great question. Thanks, Kelsey. So the anti-critical race theory campaign, which was in 2020, 2021, was kind of the lead up to the 2022 election. And then what we're facing now is the anti-DEI campaign, which is the lead up to the 2024 election. So both of these campaigns were explicitly designed to essentially sow conflict in local communities in order to make people afraid, in order to, which really feeds conservatism, but also to undermine what students are learning, to have more control over what students are learning in our schools, and to undermine progressive institutions. So I think it's important to recognize that these are very politicized campaigns. They're incredibly well coordinated and well funded. And what makes them hard to address is that if you basically sow conflict at the local level in 14,000 different school boards, how does somebody respond to 14,000 different things? And the people who are on those school boards or who are in those communities are often taken for aback, like, well, what do we do now? And I think the thing to understand, and this is coming from Micah Pollock, who is one of the UCLA researchers, along with John Rogers, who wrote a book called The Conflict Campaign Report, outlining that whole anti-CRT campaign and the political impetus behind it. She says, these are not, even though these are well-funded, well-coordinated campaigns, ultimately they consist of individuals going to their local governments, their local school boards, and spouting a couple very simple talking points. And so the response needs to be at the local level. And it needs to be that people go to their school boards and say, speak up on the other side. And the talking points don't have to be complicated. They just have to be made. so like to say, like, I believe in the freedom to read. That could be a talking point. I believe in the freedom to learn. I want my student learning about the full range of gender identity. I want my student learning Black history. When we show up locally, even when we're active on our school's Facebook pages, when we're affirming teachers who choose to teach things that we know have been questioned in other districts, all of that actually makes a difference. And it's confusing because all of this stuff is happening nationally, and it feels like we need to have a national response. But in fact, this is where that individual level organizing is so important. And when I get to the meeting, I want to be really clear about what my talking points are. But in order to recruit other folks to come into the meeting, it can be effective to use some of the strategies in this book of talking one-on-one with people, not shaming them for what they don't know, but finding out what they don't know so that you can help them learn. Moms for Liberty is similarly it's similarly viral in the way that it is in so many different places. But part of our work is finding out, like, where do we know people who are in school districts that are really under attack, and what kind of support do they need so that we can help them practice, role play, support them in going to their meetings. But I think one of the things that this is really calling attention to is the incredible importance of local government. And I remember reading in like 2016, I think, that part of the success of Trump's presidential campaign at that time was that they realized the importance of local politics, and they had people organizing in like local IHOPs around school board and local municipality elections. And I feel like one of the things that I have needed to wake up to is that this, like, who's in charge locally really matters. and that it's also something that not a lot of people are paying attention to. And so we can have a big impact if we're paying attention. And we need to be, obviously we need to be paying attention because we see what has happened in the meantime.
Well, Ali, thank you so much. Before we close, I just want to thank my colleagues, Carla, Annie, Lana, and Dr. Sean Harper for their extraordinary support in offering this free event to educators around the country. Thank you so much for everyone who's joining us. Ali, it's been a tremendous honor to talk with you this evening about your incredibly important book.
Thanks, John. So good to be here. So good to see everybody. Good luck out there. And I look forward to crossing paths sometime soon. Take care.
Well, thank you. And before you leave, please note our next Equity Book Talk event held on June 3rd with Dr. Toby Jenkins, featuring her book, The Hip Hop Mindset, Success Strategies for Educators and Other Professionals. On behalf of USC Race and Equity Center, we thank everyone for joining us.
Thank you, Ali.
Thanks, John. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Leslie, good to see you all.